The cold at -40 does not feel like temperature. It feels like the air itself has turned against you, like something with intention has decided to enter your body through every exposed surface and dismantle it from the inside. It is not the cold of a winter morning or a freezer or a cold room. It is the cold of a place that was never meant to contain human life, and it knows this, and it works with the patience of geology to remind you. Your fingers stop sending useful information after about 3 minutes of exposure. After 10, they stop sending any information at all. The skin on your face tightens until it feels like a mask that belongs to someone else, and then the mask stops feeling like anything, and that absence of feeling is the most terrifying thing, because the absence of pain in extreme cold is not relief. It is the body beginning to accept terms that you have not agreed to. And the whiteout is its own category of horror. People who have never been in a true whiteout think of it as heavy snow, as reduced visibility, as a bad storm. It is not those things. A whiteout is the annihilation of visual reference. The ground and the sky become the same white and the same brightness and the same nothing. And your eyes, which have spent your entire life being useful, become irrelevant. You cannot tell if the surface 2 feet in front of you is flat or a drop of 6 meters. You cannot tell which direction the wind is coming from because the wind is coming from everywhere. You cannot tell if you are moving or standing still without looking at your feet. And sometimes looking at your feet is not sufficient information either because the snow beneath them is moving too. A whiteout does not just take your vision. It takes your spatial relationship to the world. It takes the part of your brain that knows where you are and replaces it with a white static that has no information in it at all. This is where 2 men found themselves in the Alaskan interior. This is the human limit. I am your host. If you have the stomach for stories that strip the comfortable skin off of human nature and show you what is underneath, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the like button. What I am about to tell you is the account of a man who reached into a sleeping bag in the dark of a dying tent at -40 degrees and took the only GPS unit while his partner lay broken and unconscious beside him. And then he zipped the tent shut from the outside. And then he walked into the whiteout. And then he survived. And his partner did not survive. And he wrote about it. And that document is what I am drawing from tonight. Let me start at the beginning. Their names, as he gives them in his account, are Thomas and Will. Thomas is the narrator, the one who survived, the one who wrote the pages that form the basis of this story. Will is the partner, the friend of 9 years, the man who called Thomas from a hospital payphone when Thomas's father died, and stayed on the line for 4 hours, saying nothing in particular, because nothing in particular was what Thomas needed. These details matter. Not because they change the mathematics that Thomas eventually arrived at, but because they establish what the mathematics cost. They were 4 days into a traverse of a remote section of the Alaskan range, a route that experienced alpine travelers complete in this season, with the right preparation and the right equipment and the right conditions. They had the preparation and the equipment. The conditions turned on the 2nd day and became something different on the 3rd day, and became what I would describe as existentially hostile on the 4th day, which is the day the story begins in earnest. Thomas writes about the arrival of the storm with the specific attention of someone who has replayed those hours many times, looking for the moment when a different decision would have changed the outcome. He wrote, "The morning of the 4th day, the sky had a quality I had seen before in ranges and had learned to respect. A flatness to the light that was not cloud cover exactly, but something more like the sky deciding to withdraw, to stop participating. Will noticed it too. We discussed whether to camp early, and we decided against it because our position that morning was exposed, and the terrain 2 hours ahead offered better shelter options, and we believed we had the time to reach it. That belief was one of several beliefs that day that turned out to be incorrect. The storm arrived faster than the sky had suggested it would. Not unusually fast for Alaska in that season, but faster than they had budgeted for in their movement calculations. And in wilderness travel, the difference between the storm you planned for and the storm that arrives is sometimes the difference between a difficult day and a catastrophic one. Within 40 minutes of the first real wind, the visibility had dropped to what Thomas estimates as 3 to 4 meters, which is enough to see your partner directly in front of you and nothing beyond them. Within 90 minutes, it was a true whiteout. They roped together. This is correct procedure, and they both knew it, and they executed it. The rope between them was 12 meters, and it was the last reliable piece of spatial information they had. The knowledge that whatever was at the other end of the rope was Will, and whatever Will was standing on was ground. Everything else was white noise. The hole was not visible. Thomas describes it as a wind scour feature, a place where the prevailing winds had excavated a depression in the snowpack, and then subsequent snowfall had roofed it over with a thin crust that looked, in the flat white light of a whiteout, exactly like the surface around it. Will stepped onto it with his full weight on his right leg, and it gave way, and his leg went through at an angle that the leg is not designed to go through, and Thomas heard the sound over the wind, which tells you something about the sound, because the wind was very loud. He wrote, "I have heard people describe the sound of a bone breaking in an accident or a fall, and they usually describe it as a crack or a snap, something sharp and sudden. What I heard was different. It was more like a sound you feel in your teeth than hear with your ears, a deep structural wrongness that your body recognizes before your brain finishes processing it." And then Will's voice, which I had heard in every register over 9 years, in a register I had never heard before and did not want to hear again. Getting Will out of the hole and into the tent took 45 minutes. The tent was the small 3-season shelter they had been using, adequate for the conditions they had planned for, marginally adequate for the conditions they now faced. They got inside. Thomas assessed the leg as best he could without removing Will's outer layers in -40, which meant the assessment was incomplete but sufficient to establish what he already knew from the sound and from the angle: the fibula, and almost certainly the tibia, displaced, the kind of injury that in a hospital represents a difficult surgery and a significant recovery, and in the Alaskan interior in a whiteout represents something Thomas was not yet ready to name. Will was in significant pain. The analgesics in their kit were not designed for this level of injury, and Thomas administered what he had, and it helped with the edges of the pain without addressing the center of it. Will's breathing stabilized. His color, what Thomas could see of it, was not good. The tent held. The storm continued. This is where Thomas begins what he calls in his account the mathematics. He wrote, "I want to be precise about the sequence of my thinking, because the sequence matters, and because I am aware that the version of this story that is easiest to tell is the version where the conclusion I reached was reached quickly and cleanly, where the logic was so obvious that it was never really a moral question, just a calculation. That version is not accurate. The accurate version is that I spent approximately 3 hours in that tent moving toward the conclusion the way you move toward something you do not want to see. Slowly and with many stops and with the specific bad faith of a person who keeps looking for an exit that is not there. The distance to the nearest shelter, a ranger station marked on their maps, was approximately 19 kilometers. In good conditions, on packed snow, with 2 healthy people, 19 kilometers is a long day but a manageable one. In a whiteout, in unconsolidated snow that averaged knee-deep with sections significantly deeper, the effective travel rate drops to something between 1 and 2 kilometers per hour for a healthy individual moving alone with full pack. For 2 people, one of whom has a displaced tibial fracture and cannot bear weight on the injured leg, the mathematics of that calculation produce a number that Thomas describes as the number he spent 3 hours refusing to look at directly. He wrote, "I kept constructing alternative scenarios. I ran through every piece of equipment we had looking for something I had not considered. I thought about improvised sleds and their viability in deep, unconsolidated snow, which is poor. I thought about shelter-in-place options and their viability against a storm that showed no signs of abating, and with our fuel reserves, which would last approximately 18 additional hours at the consumption rate required to maintain survivable tent temperature. I thought about the satellite emergency beacon and the fact that in these conditions and at our location, the response time for a rescue team would be measured in days, not hours, and that days was not a number our fuel reserves could support. I ran every scenario I could construct, and every scenario I could construct arrived at the same place. Carrying Will, or supporting Will, in any ambulatory configuration that the terrain would permit would reduce their combined travel rate to something that, against the distance and the temperature and the storm, did not result in survival. It resulted in 2 people dying of hypothermia at different points along 19 kilometers of empty wilderness, instead of 1 person dying in a tent. I need to be clear about something here, because Thomas is clear about it in his account, and clarity is the only thing I can offer you. He was not certain. The mathematics of extreme survival are not the mathematics of a problem set. They are estimates layered on estimates, each one carrying its own margin of error, and when you multiply enough uncertain estimates together, the product can be false. Thomas knew this. He writes about knowing this with a specificity that suggests he has used this knowledge many times since as both a comfort and an instrument of self-torture, which is perhaps what all genuine uncertainty becomes when the outcome has already happened and cannot be changed. He wrote, "There was a version of the calculation in which we both made it. I could construct that version. It required optimal snow conditions for the next 3 kilometers, which I could not guarantee. It required Will's pain management to stay within the range that permitted movement, which I could not guarantee. It required the storm to decrease rather than increase in intensity over the following 6 hours, which I could not guarantee. It required me to maintain a travel rate that I was not certain I could maintain while supporting another person's weight in those conditions, which I could not guarantee. Each individual uncertainty was possible. Together they formed a chain of best-case assumptions that I did not believe represented reality, and that I did not believe I had the right to bet Will's death on." And then Thomas writes something that I have thought about many times since reading it. He wrote, "I also could not guarantee that I was thinking correctly. Cold at that level affects cognition in ways that are documented and measurable. And I had been at temperature for 4 days, and the cold reaches you even in a tent, even in a sleeping bag, even with all the gear working as intended. It gets into the calculations. It makes the certainties feel more certain than they are. And I could not determine, from inside my own cognition, whether the clarity I felt about the mathematics was genuine clarity or the false clarity of a brain that was beginning to conserve resources. This is the thing I have never been able to resolve. Not whether the mathematics were correct, whether I was the right instrument to do the mathematics with." Will slept at some point after midnight. Not a natural sleep. The combination of pain and cold and the analgesics produced something that Thomas describes as an absence, a suspension of the person rather than rest. His breathing was slow, and his color was wrong, and his hands were cold inside the sleeping bag in a way that Thomas noticed and noted and could not do anything about. Thomas writes about the next hour with the granular attention of someone who has reconstructed it so many times that it has become permanent architecture in his memory. He wrote, "I sat for a long time just listening. The storm against the tent. Will's breathing. The specific silence of -40, which is not actually silence. It is the absence of any biological sound. The absence of wind in trees or water or animals. The sound of a landscape that has decided to reduce itself to its minimum. I have never heard anything lonelier than that silence, and I have been in a lot of remote places. There is something in extreme cold that strips the world down to a frequency that human beings were not designed to be on. And sitting in that tent, listening to that frequency and to Will's breathing, I understood something about what I was about to do and what it would mean that I understood before I had finished deciding. I was not taking Will's chance of survival. By that point, I had convinced myself, correctly or incorrectly, that Will's chance of survival in the tent was already close to 0, regardless of what I did. What I was taking was something else. I was taking the possibility that I was wrong. I was taking the version of the situation in which my mathematics were off by enough to matter, in which the optimal conditions materialized, in which Will somehow moved, and the storm somehow cooperated, and both of us somehow arrived at the ranger station with our fingers and our minds intact. I was taking that version of events, and I was making it impossible. And I have never found a way to make that fact into something I can live with comfortably, only something I can live with. He checked the GPS first. The battery indicator showed 62%, which was sufficient. The device had a stored waypoint for the ranger station. He confirmed the bearing. He did this slowly and methodically because his hands were already stiffening inside the tent gloves, and outside the tent they would have minutes before fine motor control became unreliable. He was doing the calculations even now, the resource management of a body in extreme cold, the inventory of what he had and how long it would last, and what the expenditure rate would be in the conditions he was about to enter. He dressed in the tent, which required a quality of patience and precision that he describes as the most concentrated physical effort of the sequence, because every layer had to go on correctly and quickly, because the time spent in the tent dressing was time not moving and not generating heat. He describes each layer with the specificity of someone who understands that the difference between the right layering system and the wrong one is not comfort but survival. He was aware throughout this process of Will's breathing beside him. He was aware of the specific quality of presence that Will had even unconscious, the weight of a known person in a small space, the particular density that 9 years of friendship gives to another human being's proximity. He did not wake him. He writes about this directly, which is one of the things I find most significant about the account. He does not omit the possibility of waking Will or explain it away. He confronts it. He wrote, "I could have woken him. I have thought about what that conversation would have been. I think Will would have understood the mathematics, or some version of them. Will was intelligent and experienced, and not given to self-deception. I think he would have seen the calculation. I also think that waking him would have changed what I was doing into something that required his participation in his own abandonment, and I did not have whatever that requires. I am not sure whether that was cowardice or mercy or some combination that does not have a clean name. I have not arrived at a satisfactory answer, and I no longer believe a satisfactory answer is available." The GPS went into the inner chest pocket against his body, where the heat would preserve the battery performance in the cold. This was correct cold weather protocol, and he executed it correctly. He writes about picking up the GPS for the last time before leaving, as the moment the decision became irreversible. Until that moment, there was still the theoretical possibility of a different sequence. After it, there was not. He looked at Will. He writes, "I looked at him for what I believe was about 2 minutes, though I am not certain of the time. He was on his side with his face toward the wall of the tent. The injured leg was on top, slightly elevated, the improvised padding I had arranged still in place. His breathing was the slow, medicated breathing of someone whose body is working harder than it should to maintain the functions that breathing represents. His sleeping bag was zipped to his chin. I had done this. I had arranged everything I could arrange for him before I arranged for myself, and I am aware of how small this is against what I was about to do. But it is what I did, and I am not willing to pretend otherwise. I thought about his voice on the phone the night my father died. I thought about a specific afternoon on a river in British Columbia 7 years ago when Will made a navigation error that added 3 days to a trip and spent the entire 3 days making it funny instead of a disaster. I thought about the particular way he had of being present in a wilderness that most people find alienating, the way the remoteness that intimidates the rest of us seemed to be his natural habitat. I thought about what it would be like to be him when he woke up in the tent and understood what the absence of the GPS meant. I thought about this for the 2 minutes I stood there, and then I stopped thinking about it because if I continued thinking about it, I would not be able to open the zipper. I opened the zipper. The cold that entered was not metaphorical. It was immediate and physical and complete. The -40 rushing into the tent like something that had been waiting outside for this exact moment, which in a sense it had. Will stirred but did not wake. I do not know if that was luck or the medication or the specific depth of his unconsciousness, but he did not wake, and I stepped out and I closed the zipper from the outside. The sound of the zipper closing is the sound Thomas returns to most often in the account. He describes it in several places, always with the same specific detail. The metallic sound of the slider moving along the track, the small resistance at the top where the zipper always stuck slightly, the finality of it. He writes that he has heard that sound in other contexts since, other tents on other trips, and that the recurrence is not something he has learned to manage, only something he has learned to expect. The whiteout had not diminished. He oriented himself by compass bearing to the stored GPS waypoint and began walking. He writes about the first hour of that walk with a quality of attention that is almost forensic. Every physical detail cataloged, the depth of the snow and its consistency, the wind direction and its variations, the specific effort of each step in unconsolidated powder. He was warm from the exertion within 20 minutes, which was correct and expected. He was warm in the way that extreme cold allows a moving body to be warm, which is the warmth of physics rather than comfort, the warmth of expenditure that will not last indefinitely and must be managed against the distance remaining. He did not allow himself to think about Will during the walk. He writes about this with some precision, about the specific discipline required to redirect cognition that kept trying to return to the tent, the breathing, the zipper sound. He focused on the bearing. He focused on his feet. He counted steps when his mind tried to wander, a technique he had used in other difficult wilderness situations, as a way of occupying the part of the brain that produces narrative with something sufficiently tedious to prevent that narrative from forming. The technique was imperfect. He writes, "I was not always successful at keeping my mind on the bearing. In the second hour, when the effort and the cold had been working on my cognition long enough to reduce the effectiveness of the counting technique, I thought about him. Not in a linear or narrative way, in the way that cold affects thought, which is in fragments and images without the connective tissue that makes them into a story. I thought about his breathing. I thought about the tent moving in the wind. I thought about the temperature inside the tent, which I could calculate approximately, and the rate at which it would drop as the storm pulled heat from the nylon and the insulation. And I thought about the specific number of hours before that temperature became incompatible with the biology of a sleeping person. And then I stopped thinking about it because thinking about it was not useful and was going to cost me something I could not afford to spend in that cold, on that bearing, with that distance still ahead." He reached the ranger station 14 hours after he left the tent. The ranger on duty found him at the door, hypothermic, with frostbite on 3 fingers of his right hand where the glove had failed in the final 2 hours, barely coherent but functional enough to give the location of the tent and to tell them about Will, and to watch the expression on the ranger's face as he made the radio call. The rescue team reached the tent location 11 hours after Thomas arrived at the station. Will was dead. The cause of death was hypothermia. The medical examiner's report noted the tibial and fibular fractures as contributing factors to the rapidity of the hypothermia, which is accurate. When the body is managing trauma of that magnitude, it cannot simultaneously manage thermal regulation at that temperature with any effectiveness, and the combined demand of the injury and the cold exceeded what Will's body could sustain. The report was precise and complete, and contained nothing that contradicted Thomas's account. The report did not address the GPS. The report did not ask whether Will had been conscious when Thomas left. The report did not examine the zipper. Thomas was not charged with any crime. The investigation found no basis for criminal negligence or abandonment charges under the specific legal framework applicable to wilderness survival situations in that jurisdiction. The finding was consistent with the established legal principle that individuals in genuine survival emergencies are not required to sacrifice their own lives in attempts to save others when those attempts are not reasonably likely to succeed. The law, as Thomas notes in his account, does not care about the zipper sound. He wrote, "I have read the legal finding many times. I understand what it says. I understand that the framework it applies is the correct framework for the purposes of legal culpability, and that the conclusion it reaches is defensible within that framework. I have also spent 7 years understanding that the framework does not address what I actually did, and what it cost and what it purchased, and what the exchange rate of that transaction is when you measure it in terms that legal frameworks are not designed to measure. I purchased my survival with the abandonment of someone who trusted me with his safety in the specific way that wilderness partners trust each other, which is a trust that does not have a civilian equivalent. It is a trust built on the understanding that the environment you are both in is indifferent to your survival, and that the only thing that stands between each of you and that indifference is each other. I violated that trust in the most complete way available to me. I did it, I believe, because the mathematics supported it. I did it, I know, in the specific way that I was capable of doing it, which was in silence, while he was unconscious, without asking him. And I cannot determine, and have never been able to determine, whether the silence was something I owed him or something I owed myself. What I can tell you is what I know about what remained after. I finished the account he kept of the period following the rescue, the weeks and months, and the slow passage into years. He describes the specific quality of the world after, the way ordinary warmth became complicated, the way tent zippers in any context became complicated, the way the name Will in conversation with other people became a navigational problem that he solved sometimes well and sometimes not. He describes the particular loneliness of carrying knowledge that cannot be shared completely, that exists in its full form only inside the person who holds it, that changes shape when translated into language the way all private knowledge changes shape, losing the dimensions that language does not have room for. He wrote, near the end of the account, "People ask me sometimes if I would do it differently. Not many people, because not many people know enough of the story to ask the question meaningfully. But the ones who know enough to ask usually want me to say no, I would not do it differently, because no is the answer that confirms the mathematics and locates the decision in the category of tragic necessity rather than moral failure. And I understand why they want that answer. It is easier to hold. It resolves something. I cannot give it to them. What I can tell you is that the mathematics were the mathematics. The distance was the distance, and the temperature was the temperature, and the storm was the storm, and the leg was broken in the way that it was broken. These things did not change because of what I wanted. They were what they were. What I can also tell you is that I hear the zipper. Not always, not every day the way it was in the first year, but in the specific quality of silence that -40 produces, the silence that has no biological sound in it, the silence of a landscape that has decided to reduce itself to its minimum. I hear it, the metallic slide of it, the small resistance at the top. And in those moments, I am not a survivor. I am just a man standing outside a tent in the dark, and on the other side of the nylon, someone is breathing, the way that cold and medication and a broken leg make a person breathe, and I have just made the decision irrevocable. That is the human limit. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment, tell me what you would have done in that tent at -40, with the GPS in your hand and the zipper between you and the storm. Tell me where the line is between the mathematics and the mercy and the cowardice, if you can find it. Because Thomas has been looking for 7 years, and he has not found it. And I have been sitting with his account for months, and I have not found it either. I read every comment. I will be back with another story from the place where the difference between who we think we are and who we discover ourselves to be is measured in distance and temperature and the sound of a zipper closing in the dark. The cold is still there. It was there before any of this, and it will be there after all of it. It does not remember Will, and it does not remember Thomas, and it does not record what happened inside that tent the way that human beings need things recorded. It simply maintains its temperature, as it has always maintained it, as it will always maintain it, indifferent and absolute, and patient in the way that only things without consciousness can be truly patient. Somewhere in the Alaskan interior there is a place where a tent was pitched, and a man woke up alone and understood what the absence of the GPS meant. And that understanding is the last thing Thomas gave him, and Thomas has been trying to determine what kind of gift that is ever since.